On the cold North Atlantic seas, the wind was the first enemy. Out on the open deck of a Viking longship, there was no escape from the cutting air that swept in from the Arctic. It didn't just chill the skin, it pierced it. Every breath was sharp, every gust carrying the sting of salt spray and icy mist. The cold of the North Sea was relentless, wrapping itself around every limb, sinking into every joint, and sapping every ounce of warmth the body tried to hold. To survive this, the Vikings relied on one thing above all else: preparation. Every garment was meticulously chosen, woven, and layered to create an unyielding barrier against the elements. Archaeological evidence reveals that their clothing was far more advanced than we might assume. They understood layering intuitively. Against the skin, a soft linen shirt provided a comfortable base. Over that, a heavy woolen tunic, densely woven and treated with lanolin, offered insulation that would still work even when damp. Lanolin, the natural oil found in sheep's wool, made these garments naturally water-repellent, a vital feature when icy waves crashed across the deck. The legs were protected by wool trousers, often reinforced with leather panels at the knees and thighs. Around the calves and shins, the Vikings wrapped long strips of wool called whinings. These acted like ancient gaiters, holding heat in and keeping seawater out. And then there were the cloaks, those iconic pieces of Viking attire that could double as a sleeping blanket. Cloaks were made of the same thick, oiled wool, sometimes lined with fur for extra warmth. Fastened with bronze or iron brooches, they could be drawn tight around the body, forming a cocoon of heat. Footwear was another matter of survival. Viking boots were often crafted from sealskin, reindeer hide, or cow leather, and they were lined with wool or stuffed with straw to trap heat and absorb moisture. The straw wasn't crude padding, it was clever engineering, wicking dampness away from the feet and keeping them dry. A wet foot in the North Atlantic was a death sentence. Headgear and gloves were equally crucial. Wool caps or hoods, sometimes fur-lined, kept heat from escaping through the head. Mittens, too, were common, even if they were bulky and awkward. Everything was designed with one purpose: to keep the human body warm enough to survive another day at sea. When the sun disappeared beneath the jagged horizon and the sky turned black, the true test began. Nightfall on a Viking longship wasn't just dark, it was a confrontation with the raw indifference of the northern sea. The stars above offered no warmth, and the moonlight merely glinted off ice-crusted timber and churning black waves. There were no cabins on a longship, no enclosed space to retreat. The deck was open from bow to stern, exposed to wind, sleet and spray. Sleep wasn't a period of rest, it was a calculated risk. But the Vikings had adapted to it, building routines and rituals to preserve their strength. Before sleep, the crew would prepare their bedding the same way soldiers ready for battle. Animal hides, carefully chosen and packed in oilskin bundles, were unrolled first. Reindeer pelts were prized for their incredible insulation, while sheepskins and seal hides added further layers. These hides weren't laid out luxuriously. They were pressed tight against the planks to form a barrier between warm flesh and the damp wood. The goal was simple: prevent the cold from crawling into the body through every surface. Cloaks were pulled tighter around the shoulders, often layered or doubled for those fortunate enough to afford extra wool. Hoods were drawn down low, and mittens kept on while sleeping. The body was curled inward, minimising surface area and trapping heat. Nothing was left exposed that didn't absolutely have to be. But perhaps the most critical tactic was collective heat. The Vikings understood the principle long before science would explain it. Shared warmth meant shared survival. The crew slept side by side, sometimes in staggered layers, their backs pressed close, cloaks overlapping. This huddle wasn't camaraderie, it was strategy. In the dead of winter, one man's body heat could make the difference between life and frostbite for the man next to him. Sleep came in fits. At times the ship tilted violently with the waves, jolting the men awake. At others, sea spray would rain down, soaking cloaks and pelts alike and requiring immediate adjustment. The cold was patient and persistent. By morning, the hides and cloaks would often be frozen stiff, their edges rimmed with frost. Fingers were numb, muscles cramped, and the work of warming up began again. But no one ever expected warmth, they expected survival. And for those who endured, that was enough. Open flame was one of the most dangerous things a Viking could bring aboard a wooden longship, surrounded by dry timber, tarred rope, and the constant threat of shifting waves. A mismanaged fire could spell catastrophe, and yet fire remained essential. To balance necessity with danger, Viking crews carried small, carefully managed fireboxes, portable hearths made of clay or iron, sometimes lined with ash, sand or stone. These boxes contained glowing coals, banked carefully with dried moss or wood shavings to keep them smouldering without catching flame. The embers, nurtured like gold, were never allowed to die. Reigniting a fire from scratch in the middle of the North Sea would have been nearly impossible. The firebox wasn't used to warm the entire ship. Its function was narrow and precise. It could thaw frozen fingers, warm a mug of broth, or dry a pair of stiff mittens. A small iron pot might be balanced over it to heat water or prepare a medicinal tonic. This was not a hearth of comfort, it was a tool of survival. On longer voyages, one firebox might circulate among a group of men, each taking brief turns to press their hands over it. Heat was shared as much as it was rationed. The embers became symbolic, proof that warmth still existed in a world that seemed made entirely of ice, wind and salt. But the true power of fire emerged when the Longship made landfall. Beaching the vessel allowed the crew to light real fires, tall, crackling flames that banished the chill, dried soaked clothes and lifted morale. The sails might be taken down and used as makeshift shelters, forming a windbreak around the fire. Boots were packed with hot stones to restore pliability. Woolen garments were laid near the flames to steam away the damp, their lanolin-rich fibres springing back to life. At these moments, fire wasn't just warmth, it was rebirth. It brought colour back to the cheeks, feeling back to the limbs, and strength back to the body. Even in the briefest stops, fire allowed the Vikings to reset, to reclaim their humanity before returning to the ruthless cold of the sea. While cloaks and hides insulated the outside, the Vikings knew that true warmth had to be fueled from within. Their bodies were furnaces, and the only way to keep the fire burning was to feed it with high-energy, heat-producing food. Viking seafarers packed their ships not with luxuries, but with calorie-dense provisions. Dried fish, often cod or herring, were preserved with salt and smoke, their oily flesh delivering long-lasting energy. Salted pork was another staple, rich, fatty and capable of enduring weeks at sea without spoiling. Hard bread made from barley or rye, commonly known as hardtack, was nearly indestructible, and often softened with broth or water before consumption. It was bland but filling. Cheese was included too, hardened into wheels that could last the length of a voyage. But the true key to warmth lay in fat. Whale blubber, butter, and animal lard were stored in leather sacks and wooden tubs. These weren't considered delicacies. They were weapons. Fat is slow to digest and yields sustained energy. It stokes the body's internal fire better than any sugar or lean meat. A strip of blubber or a spoonful of butter could mean the difference between enduring the cold or succumbing to it. On especially brutal days, warm broth was prepared. If water and heat were available, a handful of dried meat and marrow bones might be boiled over a firebox or land fire, producing a nutrient-rich liquid that delivered heat and strength in equal measure. This broth wasn't for enjoyment, it was medicine, warmth in liquid form. Interestingly, mead or ale, often thought of as Viking staples, were rarely consumed during voyages for warmth. Alcohol thins the blood and gives a false sense of heat, making it dangerous in freezing conditions. If it was present, it was used sparingly, for morale, not survival. The Viking diet at sea wasn't an accident. It was a survival mechanism, honed through experience and necessity. Every bite was calculated to feed the internal flame and keep the body burning long after the sun had disappeared, and the cold crept in to claim its toll. There was one rule on a Viking longship that every sailor understood: keep moving or freeze. The sea punished stillness. The cold didn't need hours to strike, it needed only minutes. Work was the only heater they could rely on during long stretches between landfalls. When the sails were slack and the winds fell silent, the oars took over. Rowing wasn't just a means of forward motion, it was the body's defence against hypothermia. Each pull on the oar set muscles burning, forced the heart to pump blood, and generated the friction needed to survive. But even when the sails were full, movement didn't stop. Men remained active, bailing water from the hull, tightening ropes, adjusting sail lines, scrubbing ice from the planks, repairing torn clothing, inspecting gear. Anything to keep the body in motion. Even shivering, unpleasant as it was better than stillness. It was the last involuntary defence the body had against the deepening cold. The sea demanded constant attention. Waves soaked the deck, freezing as they fell. Ice had to be chipped away. Salt encrusted everything, and cold stiffened the joints. Standing still for more than a few minutes risked losing all sensation in the fingers, feet, or face. Movement wasn't optional, it was survival. The physical demands of Viking seafaring were unrelenting. Every action kept the blood flowing, and every task was a shield against the creeping chill. The Longship was both battlefield and gymnasium. The cold was always advancing, and the only way to beat it was to never stop. The Longship itself was a survival tool as much as it was a weapon of exploration and conquest. Its design minimised exposure to the worst elements while maximising flexibility. The planks were overlapped in a technique called clinker building, which allowed the hull to flex with the waves rather than fight them. The seams were caulked with a mix of tar and animal hair or moss, creating a tight seal against icy seawater. Tarred woolen tarps could be stretched across the deck to form crude shelters. These makeshift canopies helped deflect rain and wind, creating pockets of relative warmth where the crew could gather. Though not luxurious, these shelters were often the difference between enduring the journey or succumbing to the elements. The battle against cold wasn't fought with clothing alone, it was fought in the mind. A Viking's mental fortitude was as vital as any cloak or firebox. From childhood, they were hardened by the harsh Scandinavian winters, fetching water from frozen streams, working outdoors in snow, and tending livestock in brutal conditions built resilience. The sagas and oral traditions celebrated this toughness, praising those who could endure the worst weather without complaint. This mindset carried on to the sea. The crew expected hardship, embraced it even, as a test of strength and character. Cold wasn't seen as something to fear. It was simply part of life. When storms grew too fierce or the sea threatened to overwhelm them, the Vikings didn't fight the elements. They adapted to them. Landfall was both a blessing and a battlefield, because the cold didn't stop just because they were off the water. The moment the Longship scraped onto a beach or narrow fjord, the crew transformed from sailors to builders. Every movement had a purpose. The sail was unfastened and dragged onto land, becoming the fabric of a makeshift shelter. Oars were pulled from their slots and planted upright in the sand or soil, acting as crude support poles. The sail, coated in tar to protect it from seawater, now became a windbreak or roof, repelling rain, sleet and snow. The ground inside the temporary camp was always prepared carefully. Animal hides, especially reindeer skins, were laid fur side up to create a dry sleeping surface. Straw, brushwood, or pine boughs were sometimes added beneath to create further insulation. The crew knew that body heat was easily stolen by direct contact with frozen ground. A fire was the first true priority once they had stabilised the ship and arranged a crude shelter. Driftwood was collected if they were lucky, or dried logs carried from previous camps were hauled out from the ship's stores. A fire was lit not only for warmth, but also to dry soaked clothing, prepare food, and boost morale. Its glow was life itself, a beacon against the dark void of the northern night. At times, these camps lasted a single night, just long enough for the storm to pass. On longer voyages, the crew might remain for days, repairing sails, drying every wool cloak and hide, and cooking in bulk before returning to the open sea. A well-established temporary camp could resemble a miniature settlement, with stone fire pits, sleeping spaces, and small caches of food and wood prepared for emergencies. Even these brief rests were brutally cold. The Vikings would stack stones around the fire to create heat-retaining walls, or lay planks of wood across to block the wind. The sail could be angled to deflect gusts, creating a narrow corridor of relative comfort where the crew huddled together to sleep. There was a strategy behind every decision. They knew that exposure to wetness was as deadly as frost. Wet wool, no matter how well woven, would eventually fail. So garments were placed near the fire to dry, boots stuffed with warm stones and mittens steamed until they softened. But these shelters were never permanent. The crew understood that warmth was fleeting. The sea called them back, and the Longship, always ready, was their lifeline. The beach camp was a pause, a breath between battles with the elements, but never a retreat. The Vikings were observers of the natural world, and their survival strategies reflected a deep respect for the creatures that thrived in the same hostile environments. They didn't just conquer the north, they learned from it. They watched wolves huddle together in the snow, pressing bodies tightly to conserve heat. The Vikings did the same on their longships and in their shelters, sleeping shoulder to shoulder beneath shared hides. It wasn't camaraderie, it was instinct, borrowed from the natural order. They saw how seals, whales and bears survived long winters by storing fat, and they mimicked it. A diet rich in blubber, lard and oily fish gave them the caloric reserves they needed for voyages lasting weeks. Fat wasn't just food, it was insulation for the body, energy that burned slow and hot, keeping their core temperature stable against freezing winds. The furs they wore were another reflection of nature's teachings. Bear hides, fox pelts and reindeer skins weren't simply chosen for warmth. They were modelled after the coats of animals that thrived in Arctic conditions. By wearing what those animals wore, the Vikings carried a layer of the wild's own armour into the cold. They also understood the rhythms of weather. Birds, fish, and ocean currents served as early warning systems. If seabirds huddled close to shore or the waves changed colour, it often meant a storm was coming. Rather than pushing onward blindly, the Vikings would beach their ships and prepare for the storm's assault, conserving energy and protecting their supplies. The routes they sailed also reflected this harmony with nature. Hugging coastlines whenever possible, they sought out fjords, inlets and islands where they could stop to build fires, hunt and rest. They followed migratory paths of whales and fish, knowing these routes often aligned with calmer, safer waters. Even their shipbuilding techniques were born from observing the sea. The Longship's overlapping planks were inspired by the way fish scales shed water. Flexible, sleek, and resilient, the design allowed the ship to glide with the waves rather than fight them, much like the natural movement of sea creatures. In the end, the Vikings weren't fighting nature, they were working with it. Every survival tactic was borrowed from the land and sea they knew so well. They understood that to defy nature was to die, but to learn from it was to live. The survival techniques of the Vikings are still relevant today. Arctic explorers and survivalists rely on wool, layering systems, fat-rich diets, and constant activity, principles that the Vikings perfected over 1,000 years ago. Their resilience was born not of luck, but of preparation and adaptation. They didn't just endure the cold, they mastered it, turning the harshest seas on Earth into highways of trade and conquest. Out on the cold seas, there was no margin for error. The waves were merciless, the wind unrelenting. Every choice mattered: the thickness of a cloak, the layering of hides, the heat from the smallest firebox. The Vikings survived because they understood that warmth was a battle fought on many fronts, through clothing, food, fire, movement, and mindset. Could you survive a single night on an open Viking longship, with the North Atlantic wind howling and the temperature plummeting? Most modern people wouldn't last an hour. But the Vikings did more than last. They thrived, they conquered, and they wrote their names in history by enduring where others would perish.